My name is Hannah. I am 28 years old, and I work as a bookkeeper for a mid-sized logistics firm. After my parents threw me out into a freezing Ohio rainstorm with just one trash bag of my belongings and absolutely nowhere to sleep, I tried to use my late grandfather's old black card to pay for a cheap motel. But instead of an approval, the card triggered a bizarre code. The next morning, when I handed it to a bank manager, he froze, turned completely pale, and whispered into his radio to call security and lock the doors, because I could not be allowed to leave. Before I tell you how that single piece of metal completely destroyed my parents' perfect lives, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you genuinely enjoy stories about karma finding its mark. Drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. I love reading your messages. Now let me take you back to the storm where the illusion of my family finally shattered. The freezing rain felt like needles against my face. I stood barefoot on the concrete porch of my childhood home in suburban Ohio. The heavy oak front door was wide open, framing my father Richard. His face was twisted in a kind of rage I had never seen before. Without a single word of hesitation, he lifted a heavy black plastic trash bag and hurled it directly at my feet. The thin plastic caught on a rusted porch nail and ripped wide open. My favorite sweaters, a pair of work slacks, and a handful of old photographs spilled out into the muddy puddles gathering on the concrete. They could not even give me the dignity of a suitcase. My mother Patricia stood right behind him in the warm, brightly lit hallway. Her arms were tightly crossed over her chest and her lips were pressed into a thin, furious line. I wiped the rain from my eyes, shivering in my thin blouse, and stared at the two people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The entire explosion had started over $15,000. That was my life savings. I had worked 60-hour weeks as a bookkeeper, crunching numbers, balancing ledgers, and sacrificing every single weekend for 5 long years just to build that safety net. I drove a rusty 10-year-old Honda that sounded like it was falling apart. I never took vacations. I never bought new clothes. I saved every penny I could because I knew nobody was going to catch me if I fell. But earlier that evening, my parents had cornered me in the kitchen with a demand that sounded much more like a direct order. My younger brother Brendan was getting married. Brendan was the golden child of our family. He was loud, charismatic, and completely irresponsible. Every time he wanted to start a new business, my parents remortgaged their lives to fund it. Every time he failed, they patted his back and told him he was simply ahead of his time. Now Brendan was marrying Chloe. Chloe was a woman who firmly believed the world owed her a red carpet. She had demanded a lavish wedding rehearsal dinner at the most exclusive country club in the county. My parents had already drained their own savings paying for the wedding venue, so they turned to the practical daughter. They told me it was my duty as a sister to transfer my $15,000 to cover Chloe's rehearsal dinner. I refused. For the first time in my 28 years of life, I looked them directly in the eye and said no. The fallout was apocalyptic. My mother screamed that I was holding on to money I did not even need. She yelled that I was jealous of Brendan's happiness. I stood in the kitchen and reminded them of the hard truth. I reminded them that for the past 6 years, I had been the one paying their utility bills. I paid the electric bill. I paid the gas bill. I kept the water running in that house while they bought Brendan expensive suits for job interviews he never bothered to show up for. I was the invisible pillar keeping their financial roof from caving in. But my logic meant absolutely nothing to them. To them, my money was family money, and family money belonged to Brendan. My father stepped onto the porch, the driving rain instantly soaking the shoulders of his shirt. He pointed a shaking finger right at my face. "You are a selfish burden, Hannah," he shouted over the noise of the storm. "If you cannot sacrifice for your own brother, then you are no longer a part of this family." I opened my mouth to defend myself to ask how they could possibly throw their own daughter away over a dinner party. But the heavy oak door slammed shut in my face. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed like a gunshot. It was a final verdict. I was locked out. I stood there for 5 full minutes, letting the freezing rain soak through my clothes to my skin. I gathered my wet sweaters from the mud, shoved them back into the torn trash bag, and dragged myself toward my beat-up Honda parked on the street. I felt entirely hollow. 28 years of trying to be the good daughter, the quiet helper, the reliable backup plan, had all amounted to a torn trash bag in the mud. I climbed into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. I turned the heater on high, but it only blew lukewarm air across my frozen hands. I drove away from the house I grew up in, knowing I could never go back. The Ohio roads were slick and dangerous. My windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the heavy downpour. I just needed a place to think. I just needed a warm bed to sleep in for one single night. A few miles down the highway, the flickering red neon sign of a cheap roadside motel cut through the darkness. I pulled into the empty parking lot, grabbed my purse, and dashed through the rain into the dingy lobby. The air inside smelled of stale smoke and old cleaning supplies. The night clerk barely looked up from his magazine as I approached the counter. I asked for a single room for the night. He quoted me a cheap price. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my debit card. I handed it over, feeling a small sense of relief that I at least had my emergency savings to fall back on. The clerk swiped the card. The machine beeped loudly. Declined. I frowned, completely confused. I asked him to try it again. He wiped the magnetic strip on his shirt and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped again. Declined. Panic fluttered in my chest. I pulled out my phone and quickly opened my banking application. My thumb hovered over the screen as the dashboard loaded. When the numbers appeared, all the air left my lungs. My balance was 0. My checking account was at 0. My savings account was at 0. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs. My debit card was linked to a childhood account. It was the same account I had opened when I was 16 years old. My parents were listed as co-signers on that account because I had been a minor at the time. I had never thought to separate them from it when I became an adult. I trusted them. I assumed they would never touch my money. I was completely wrong. The transaction history showed exactly what had happened just 30 minutes ago. While I was standing on the porch begging them to listen, my mother had logged into the shared banking portal. She had transferred every single penny of my $15,000 into her own private account. She completely drained my life savings out of pure spite. She wanted to force me into total submission. She wanted me to be stranded, freezing, and broke, so I would have to crawl back to their door on my hands and knees and beg for forgiveness. The profound cruelty of it made me physically nauseous. I had absolutely no money, an empty gas tank, and nowhere to go. I apologized to the annoyed clerk and walked back out into the freezing rain. I sat in my cold car, gripping the steering wheel. I felt a wave of absolute despair wash over me. I was entirely alone. I dug my freezing hands deep into the pockets of my damp jacket, desperately searching for a stray $20 bill or some loose change. Instead, my fingers brushed against something hard and heavy, hidden deep inside the lining of my inner pocket. I pulled it out. It was a solid, thick piece of black metal. It looked like a credit card, but it carried a strange, heavy weight. There were no numbers printed on the front. There was only my name, Hannah Harrison, engraved in elegant gold lettering, and the crest of Cumberland National Trust in the top corner. My late Grandpa Harrison had given this card to me 6 years ago, right before he passed away. Grandpa Harrison was my mother's father. He was a quiet, observing man. He was the only person in the entire family who ever seemed to notice exactly how I was treated. He watched my parents shower Brendan with expensive gifts while I wore second-hand clothes. He watched me quietly clean the kitchen while everyone else relaxed. On his deathbed, he had pressed this heavy black card into my palm. He held my hand tightly and looked at me with immense sadness. He told me to hide the card. He gave me one strict instruction. Use this only when they leave you with absolutely nothing. At the time, I did not understand what he meant. I told him my parents loved me. He just gave me a sad smile and told me to keep the card safe. Now, sitting in my freezing car with a zero bank balance and a torn trash bag of wet clothes, I finally understood. They really had left me with nothing. I stepped out of the car and walked back into the motel lobby. The clerk rolled his eyes as I approached the counter again. I placed the heavy black metal card on the laminate counter. It made a solid clinking sound. I asked him to try this one. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand with a look of confusion. He swiped it through the card reader. The machine processed for a long moment. It did not print a receipt. Instead, the screen flashed bright red. A loud, continuous error tone echoed in the quiet lobby. The clerk stared at the screen, his eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. He read the display out loud. Restricted. Contact branch manager immediately. The clerk pushed the card back across the counter. He looked at me with deep suspicion, as if I had just handed him something illegal. He told me the card was blocked and asked me to leave the lobby. I grabbed the card and ran back to my car. My heart was racing. The rejection felt like the final nail in the coffin. The card was useless. Grandpa Harrison must have made a mistake, or the account had been closed after he died. I locked my car doors. I climbed into the back seat because it felt slightly warmer than the front. I pulled my damp winter coat tightly over my knees, curling into a tight ball to preserve whatever body heat I had left. The rain continued to hammer violently against the roof of the car. The physical cold seeping into my bones perfectly matched the chilling betrayal I felt in my chest. I spent the entire night shivering in the dark. I stared at the black metal card resting in the palm of my hand. I watched the neon motel sign flicker through the fogged windows. I had no idea that this supposedly useless piece of metal was actually a dormant key. I had no idea that when the sun rose, I was going to walk into Cumberland National Trust and set off a chain of events that would completely destroy the people who put me out in the cold. The sun came up gray and freezing. My neck ached from sleeping slumped against the steering wheel of my Honda. My clothes were still damp from the rainstorm sticking uncomfortably to my skin. My stomach growled so loudly it hurt. I had absolutely nothing. No cash, no credit, no home. My own parents had stripped my bank account bare and locked me out in the cold, just because I refused to pay for my brother Brendan's luxurious wedding rehearsal. The only thing I had left in the entire world was the heavy black metal card my grandfather gave me before he died. At 8 a.m, I pulled into the parking lot of the downtown branch of Cumberland National Trust. The building looked like a fortress. It had towering stone columns, polished brass handles, and huge glass windows. It was the kind of place where very wealthy people kept their money. I felt completely out of place walking through those heavy doors. My shoes squeaked on the pristine marble floor. I was shivering, holding my damp jacket tight across my chest. A few people in expensive business suits gave me side glances. I just kept my head down and walked straight toward the teller line. I stepped up to the counter. The teller was a younger woman with a polite, practiced smile. I placed the strange black card on the polished marble counter along with my driver's license. The card made a dull, heavy thud. I asked her if she could check the balance. I told her it was an old account from my late grandfather, and I just needed to know if there was enough money in there to withdraw $50 for a hot meal and some dry clothes. The teller smiled kindly and picked up the card. She examined it for a second, her brow furrowing slightly at the weight of the metal and the lack of any account numbers. She flipped it over, found the magnetic strip, and ran it through her computer terminal. I held my breath. I expected the machine to beep loudly and flash the same restricted error code the motel clerk had seen the night before. I braced myself for the humiliation of being turned away again. But the machine did not beep. Instead, the teller's computer screen went completely blank for a split second and then flashed a solid, blinding yellow. The teller gasped aloud. She physically jumped back from the counter, dropping the black card as if it had suddenly caught fire. Her eyes darted from the computer screen to my driver's license and then up to my face. Her mouth opened, but she did not say a word. I asked her if something was wrong. I felt my chest tighten. I asked if the account was closed. She did not answer me. Her hands were actually shaking as she picked up her desk phone and punched in a quick extension. She turned her back to me, whispering frantically into the receiver. I could only catch fragments of her panicked voice. Yes, right now. The lobby. The Harrison card. It is her. She matches the ID. My fight or flight instinct kicked in hard. My mind started racing through the worst possible scenarios. Why was she acting like I had just handed her a stolen weapon? What if Grandpa Harrison had gotten this card illegally? What if my parents had reported me to the police for trying to steal their money, and the bank was stalling me until the cops arrived? My parents were ruthless enough to do exactly that. They had already stolen my entire life savings and thrown me in the mud. Framing me for fraud would be their perfect next step. I reached out to grab my driver's license and run. I decided I did not need the money. I just needed to get out of there before I got arrested. But before my fingers could even touch the marble counter, a heavy wooden door behind the teller line burst open. A tall, imposing man in an immaculate navy suit hurried out. He had silver hair and a very serious, deeply lined face. His name tag read Thomas Sterling, Branch Manager. He did not walk. He practically ran toward the teller counter. He grabbed my driver's license and the black metal card. He stared at the card, and then he looked up at me. I watched the color completely drain from Thomas Sterling's face. He went chalk white. He looked at me as if he were seeing a ghost. I took a step backward. I raised my hands defensively. I stammered out an apology. I told him I did not know what the card was, and that my grandfather gave it to me, and if there was a problem, I would just leave. I turned around, fully intending to sprint out the front doors and drive as far away from Ohio as my empty gas tank would take me. But Thomas Sterling grabbed the radio clipped to his belt. He did not take his eyes off me. His voice was hoarse, urgent, and terrified. "Call security," he barked into the radio. "Lock down the lobby. Lock the main doors right now. She cannot leave." I froze. The heavy brass doors at the front of the bank slammed shut with a loud, echoing boom. Two large security guards in dark uniforms stepped right in front of the exit, crossing their arms. More guards appeared from the side hallways, moving quickly across the marble floor directly toward me. My breath caught in my throat. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I was trapped. I was totally locked inside Cumberland National Trust, surrounded by guards, freezing in my wet clothes, and entirely convinced that my own family had set me up to be hauled off to federal prison. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the harsh grip of handcuffs. I thought about my father throwing my trash bag onto the porch. I thought about my mother draining my savings account. They had won. They had broken me down to nothing, and now I was going to lose my freedom too. The security guards closed the distance, their heavy boots echoing through the silent, locked-down lobby. Every single customer in the bank was staring at me. I backed up against the teller counter, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I told myself to stay calm, to beg for a phone call to explain that I was just a bookkeeper looking for enough money to buy breakfast. But the words would not come out. I was paralyzed by a deep, suffocating fear. The guards formed a tight circle around me, cutting off any possible escape route. I was completely cornered. I braced myself for the guards to grab my arms and push me to the marble floor. I waited for them to read me my rights, but they did not touch me. Instead, the four large men turned their backs to me, facing outward, creating a tight, protective physical perimeter between me and the rest of the bank lobby. Thomas Sterling stepped through the circle of guards. He was holding my black metal card and my driver's license with extreme care, almost reverence. His hands were actually shaking. He did not look angry. He looked deeply relieved. "Miss Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "please come with me immediately. You are not in trouble, but we must get you off the main floor. Right now." I was too stunned to argue. The security guards moved with us in a tight formation, escorting me away from the staring customers down a long, quiet corridor lined with expensive artwork and deep into the back of the building. We stopped in front of a massive steel door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Sterling scanned a badge punched in a long code and placed his thumb on a glass reader. The heavy door hissed and swung open. We stepped inside a large soundproof vault room, furnished with a polished mahogany table and plush leather chairs. Sterling locked the heavy steel door behind us. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. I stood near the edge of the table, dripping rainwater onto their expensive carpet, clutching my empty purse. Before I could demand to know what was happening, a woman stepped out from an adjoining private office. She wore a sharp-tailored gray suit and possessed an aura of absolute authority. She looked at me, taking in my damp clothes, my exhausted face, and my trembling hands. Her expression softened into a look of profound, angry understanding. "Hannah," she said gently, "my name is Evelyn Hayes. I am the senior estate attorney for the Harrison Trust. Your grandfather told me this day might come. I just prayed he was wrong." I stared at her, completely confused. I told her there must be some kind of massive misunderstanding. I explained that my grandfather, Grandpa Harrison, was a very sweet, simple man who lived on Social Security. I told her he did not have an estate. He died with absolutely nothing, and my parents had paid for his funeral. Evelyn exchanged a very dark, knowing look with Thomas Sterling. She walked over to the mahogany table and gestured for me to sit down. She poured me a glass of warm water from a pitcher and slid it across the wood. "Your grandfather did not die." "Broke," Hannah Evelyn said firmly. "He was one of the wealthiest commercial real estate developers in the state. He let your parents believe he lost his fortune in the market crash years ago because he knew exactly how greedy and ruthless your father Richard truly was." My brain flatlined. I took a slow sip of the water, trying to force my mind to comprehend her words. I told her that did not make any sense. My father owned a very successful mid-sized logistics firm. He was the one with the money. He was the one paying for my brother Brendan's massive, luxurious country club wedding. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Richard does not own that logistics firm, Hannah. He is simply the operating manager. The land his warehouses sit on, the fleet of trucks he uses, the parent company that funds his entire operation. All of it belonged entirely to your grandfather." The room tilted. I gripped the edges of the leather chair to keep from falling out of it. My grandfather owned my father's business. He owned everything. Sterling placed the heavy black metal card on the table between us. "That card you tried to use at the motel and the teller desk is not a credit card," he explained. "It is a highly encrypted biometric access key. It is the physical trigger for a very specific, fiercely guarded legal contingency plan." Evelyn opened a thick leather binder on the table. She pulled out a heavily notarized legal document bearing my grandfather's signature. "He loved you very much, Hannah," she said softly. "He saw how your parents treated you. He saw how they used you as a beast of burden while they poured every resource into Brendan. He wanted to leave his entire empire to you, but he knew if he did it directly upon his death, your parents would use their power and your gentle nature to force you to sign it all over to them." She turned the page, pointing to a highlighted paragraph. "So he built a dead man's switch into his trust. The estate was locked down, quietly growing hidden behind corporate shells. The only way the trust would ever execute was if your father committed an act of total financial abandonment against you." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as the pieces finally snapped together. I thought about my father throwing my clothes into the mud. I thought about my mother draining my $15,000. "Your grandfather gave you that card and told you to use it only when they left you with nothing," Evelyn continued. "When you swiped that card this morning, it triggered the system. It verified your identity and cross-checked your current financial standing. The system immediately recognized that your primary bank accounts had been hostilely drained by your co-signers Richard and Patricia." Evelyn leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the table. "By throwing you out and stealing your savings, your parents tripped the wire. The dead man's switch has been activated. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 100% of the Harrison estate bypassed your father completely. It transferred solely and irrevocably to you." I could not breathe. I stared at the black card, then at Evelyn, then at Sterling. I asked them in a voice that sounded like a frightened child exactly how much money we were talking about. Sterling typed something into a secure tablet and turned the screen toward me. $32 million in liquid assets, commercial real estate, and corporate holdings. He stated with absolute precision. You are now the sole owner of the parent company that controls your father's logistics firm. You own the roof over his head. You own the ground he walks on. $32 million. My parents had ruined my life, stolen my hard-earned $15,000, and kicked me out into the freezing rain to fund my golden child brother's fancy wedding. In doing so, they had accidentally handed me the keys to a multi-million-dollar empire. I sat there in my damp clothes, shivering, trying to process the massive, earth-shattering weight of what I had just inherited. But before I could ask another question, the phone on the conference table buzzed loudly. Sterling answered it on speakerphone. Mr. Sterling, a frantic security guard's voice echoed through the room. We have a serious problem out here in the lobby. A private investigator just tried to force his way through the front doors. He is aggressively demanding to see Hannah. He says he works for Richard, and he knows she is inside. Sterling's face hardened. He looked at me, then at Evelyn. That is why we locked down the lobby, he said grimly. When you swiped the card, it sent an automatic legal notification to the corporate attorneys representing your father's firm. They know the trust has been activated. Richard knows you have the key. He knows what he just lost, and he is sending his people to hunt you down before you realize what you actually hold. I looked at the heavy steel vault door. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. My parents were not just going to let me walk away. They were going to come for me. They were going to try to take this $32 million empire just like they took my $15,000. But as I sat in that leather chair staring at the screen displaying my new reality, the freezing, terrified girl who slept in her car the night before slowly began to disappear. She was replaced by something much colder, much harder, and ready for war. The heavy steel door of the vault felt like the only barrier between me and a world that had completely lost its mind. I sat in the plush leather chair gripping the glass of water Evelyn Hayes had poured for me. My mind was still reeling from the revelation that I was the sole heir to a $32 million empire. But before I could even process the weight of that number, the security radio on Thomas Sterling's belt cracked to life again. The voice of the head security guard echoed in the quiet room. He sounded breathless and tense. Mr. Sterling, the man is refusing to leave. He is getting aggressive. He says he is a private investigator hired by Richard Harrison, and he has a legally binding document that Hannah must sign immediately. He is trying to push past the teller line. Sterling grabbed his radio. Do not let him through. If he takes one more step toward the secure corridors, you physically remove him from the premises and call the police. I looked at Evelyn. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I asked her what kind of document my father would be trying to force me to sign right this second. Evelyn's face hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a blank legal form to show me. It is a waiver of beneficiary rights, she explained. When your parents drained your bank account and kicked you out into the storm, they triggered the dead man switch in your grandfather's trust. But they did not know they triggered it until you used that black card this morning. The moment Thomas swiped your card in the lobby, an automated legal alert was dispatched to the corporate attorneys representing your father's logistics company. I stared at her, the pieces slowly sliding into place. They know, I whispered. Yes, Evelyn said. Richard knows he just lost control of the parent company. He knows the entire $32 million estate has transferred to you. He panicked. He hired a private investigator to track you down before we could tell you the truth. If that man out there can corner you, terrify you, and physically force you to sign a waiver of beneficiary rights, before you understand what you are signing, your father can petition the court to invalidate the transfer. He wants to steal your grandfather's empire right out from under you. Sterling stepped over to a built-in monitor on the wall and tapped the screen. It displayed a live feed from the bank lobby security cameras. I stood up and walked over to watch. On the screen, a large, aggressive man in a cheap suit was shoving his finger into the chest of a bank security guard. He held a thick manila envelope in his other hand. I watched as the man tried to physically shoulder his way past the barricade. Instantly, 3 armed bank guards swarmed him. They grabbed his arms, spun him around, and forcefully marched him out the heavy brass front doors, throwing him onto the wet pavement outside. I watched the screen as the man pounded his fists against the locked glass doors in a fit of rage. I stood completely still. I did not feel fear anymore. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. My parents had not kicked me out, just because I refused to pay for my brother Brendan's lavish wedding rehearsal dinner. The screaming match on the porch, the insults, the sudden eviction. It was all a calculated performance. They had known about this trust for years. They had lived in absolute terror of the day my grandfather's dead man switch might activate. They kept me wearing secondhand clothes. They forced me to pay their utility bills. They made sure I worked 60 hours a week as a bookkeeper just to survive. They deliberately kept me exhausted, poor, and desperate, so I would never have the strength to question their authority. They conditioned me to be small and submissive, hoping that if this day ever came, I would be too broken to fight back. They thought I would just sign whatever paper they shoved in my face because I was the obedient, invisible daughter. The betrayal ran so much deeper than a wedding argument. It was a systematic, lifelong campaign of psychological abuse designed to protect their stolen wealth. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You cannot go back to your apartment, Hannah. And you certainly cannot go back to your car. Your father's investigators will be watching both places. You are a high-value target now." I asked her where I was supposed to go. Evelyn smiled. A sharp, predatory smile that made me glad she was on my side. "Your grandfather anticipated this exact scenario. He purchased a secure private penthouse downtown under a blind corporate LLC. It is fully funded by the trust, heavily guarded, and entirely untraceable to you. I'm going to have our private security team escort you there right now. But we do not have time for you to rest. We are going to war and we need ammunition." 30 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a tinted SUV, flanked by two massive private security contractors. We pulled into an underground parking garage of a luxury high-rise in downtown. They escorted me up a private elevator directly into the penthouse. The apartment was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline. The furniture was sleek and modern. It was a stark contrast to my damp clothes, my empty bank account, and the cheap motel room I had tried to sleep in just hours prior. But I did not have time to admire the view. Evelyn followed right behind me. Two men carried in 4 heavy cardboard boxes and set them down on the massive dining room table. Evelyn handed me a highly encrypted, secure laptop. "These are the raw, unedited corporate ledgers and financial records for your father's logistics company," Evelyn said, pointing to the boxes. "As the new majority shareholder of the parent company, you have the legal right to audit every single penny that moves through his firm. Richard thinks you are just a naive, ungrateful daughter. He forgot that you have spent the last 5 years working as a meticulous corporate bookkeeper." I looked at the boxes. The sheer volume of paper was intimidating, but numbers were my language. Numbers did not lie. Numbers did not manipulate you or lock you out in the rain. "I need you to find everything Evelyn instructed. I need you to follow the money. Find out exactly why Richard is so terrified of losing control. Find out why he needs Brendan's wedding to look so wealthy. If we are going to stop him from filing an injunction against the trust, we need undeniable proof of his financial incompetence." Evelyn left me alone in the penthouse with a pot of black coffee and a mission. I stripped off my damp jacket, sat down at the dining table, and cracked open the first box of ledgers. The sun set over the city, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I did not stop reading. Midnight turned into 1 in the morning. 1 in the morning turned into 3. My eyes burned and my fingers cramped from typing data into the secure laptop, but the adrenaline rushing through my veins kept me wide awake. I started by tracking the general operating expenses of the logistics firm. At first glance, everything looked relatively normal. Truck maintenance, fuel costs, warehouse leases. But as I dug deeper into the vendor payments, I started to notice strange discrepancies. There were massive monthly payouts to a consulting firm that did not have a real website or a physical office address. I cross-referenced the corporate registration numbers. The consulting firm was a shell company owned by my brother Brendan. My father was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of company money directly into Brendan's pockets to fund his lavish lifestyle. He was paying for Brendan's luxury sports cars, his expensive vacations with Chloe, and his endless string of failed tech startups. But the deeper I dug, the worse it got. The logistics company did not have the profit margins to support that kind of extreme embezzlement. The company was actually bleeding cash. So where was the money coming from? At 4 a.m, I finally found the answer, and it made my blood run completely cold. I opened a file labeled Employee Benefits and Retirement. I traced the routing numbers for the company pension fund. This was the money that hundreds of blue-collar truck drivers, warehouse packers, and mechanics had paid into for decades. These were people who trusted my father with their futures, people who worked back-breaking shifts just to secure a modest retirement. My father and Brendan were draining the employee pension fund. They were using complex accounting tricks to siphon millions of dollars out of the workers' retirement accounts, laundering it through Brendan's dummy corporations and using it to maintain their illusion of immense wealth. The $100,000 budget for Chloe's upcoming country club wedding was not family money. It was stolen money. It belonged to the man who drove a forklift for 30 years. It belonged to the woman who dispatched trucks on the night shift. My father was robbing his own loyal employees blind to buy his golden child a perfect life. I pushed the chair back from the table. My hands were shaking again, but this time it was not from fear or cold. It was from a pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. The narrative in my head completely shifted. This was no longer just about a daughter being unloved and thrown away like garbage. This was no longer just about a $15,000 stolen savings account or a petty family dispute over a wedding rehearsal. This was a massive, malicious crime that was going to destroy the lives of dozens of innocent, hardworking families. If my father managed to legally challenge the trust, if he managed to force me into giving up my grandfather's inheritance, he would drain the rest of that pension fund until there was absolutely nothing left. The employees would lose everything, and my father would walk away completely clean. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I looked out over the sleeping city. My parents had told me I was a selfish burden. They had slammed a heavy oak door in my face and left me to freeze. They thought I would break under the pressure. They thought I would cower and sign away my grandfather's legacy just to earn a scrap of their affection. They were completely wrong. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn Hayes. She answered on the first ring, sounding wide awake. "I found it," I said, my voice echoing with a hard, deadly resolve. "I found exactly what they are hiding. They are embezzling millions from the employee pension fund. They are funding Brendan's wedding with stolen retirement money." Evelyn was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp and determined. "Bring the files to my office at first light, Hannah. We are going to lock them in a financial cage they can never escape." I hung up the phone and looked back at the boxes of evidence scattered across the table. My family wanted to treat me like an invisible bookkeeper. They wanted me to just shut up and balance the checkbook. Now I was going to use those exact same skills to tear their entire criminal empire down to the studs. The war had officially started, and I was holding all the weapons. The morning sun barely pierced the heavy Ohio rain clouds as I walked into the downtown offices of the Harrison Trust. Evelyn Hayes was already waiting for me in a massive glass-walled conference room. Beside her sat a team of 3 forensic accountants. They looked exhausted, but entirely focused. I took a seat at the head of the long mahogany table. It was the exact seat my grandfather used to occupy. I placed my secure laptop down and prepared to dive into the darkest corners of my father's corporate greed. Over the next 8 hours, we tore my father's logistics company apart piece by piece. The lead forensic accountant, a sharp man named David, projected bank statements and routing numbers onto a large monitor. My father had been incredibly sloppy. He possessed the arrogance of a man who believed he would never be caught. He thought my grandfather was just a senile old man who would eventually die and leave him the keys to the kingdom. He never anticipated that a dedicated bookkeeper would one day have unlimited, unrestricted access to the deepest levels of his financial server. We followed the trail of the stolen money. My father had set up a complex web of automated transfers. Every single month, he skimmed thousands of dollars directly out of the employee pension fund. He routed the stolen cash through a fake vendor account labeled as Logistics Consulting Services. But that vendor account was directly linked to a dummy corporation owned by my brother Brendan. Brendan was using the retirement savings of hardworking truck drivers and warehouse packers to lease his luxury apartment, buy custom-tailored suits, and finance his endless string of failed technology startups. The pure scale of the theft made my stomach churn. I looked at the list of employees whose futures were being drained. I recognized many of those names. These were people who had worked for the company for 20 or 30 years. They were men and women who worked double shifts loading freight just to send their kids to college. My father was stealing their security. He was robbing them blind so Chloe could have a $100,000 country club wedding with imported flowers and a custom designer gown. My initial heartbreak over being thrown out of my childhood home completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by a cold and calculated need for absolute justice. I was not just fighting for my own survival anymore. I was fighting for every single employee my family had decided to exploit. Right in the middle of our audit, my cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood table. I looked down at the screen. It was a call from my mother, Patricia. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. I knew she was not calling to check if I was safe from the storm. I knew she was not calling to apologize for stealing my life savings. She was calling because my father's private investigator had failed to corner me at the bank. She was calling because they needed to trick me into signing away my $32 million inheritance. I put the phone on speaker and hit play so Evelyn and the accountants could hear. "Hannah, honey, it is Mom." Her voice was dripping with a sickeningly sweet artificial warmth. "Listen, your father and I were just so stressed about the wedding expenses the other night. We definitely overreacted, and we want to make things right. You are our daughter and family comes first. Please come to Brendan's wedding rehearsal dinner tomorrow night at the country club. We saved you a seat. Oh, and honey, your father left some routine tax papers for you to sign. Just boring old estate forms. We need your signature so we can close out an old account. Come have dinner with us and we can be a happy family again. Love you." The voicemail ended. The silence in the conference room was thick and heavy. I stared at the phone. For 28 years, that fake tone of voice would have made me drop everything to please her. I would have felt guilty. I would have rushed over desperate to fix whatever I had supposedly broken. But now, listening to her lie so effortlessly, I felt absolutely nothing but disgust. She called it a routine tax form. She wanted me to walk into a crowded rehearsal dinner and sign a legal waiver of beneficiary rights in front of 50 witnesses. She wanted to steal my grandfather's entire empire right out from under me and use my own signature to do it. I looked across the table at Evelyn. She raised an eyebrow, waiting for my reaction. I picked up my phone and typed a short, simple text message back to my mother. I told her I would be there. I told her I could not wait to see everyone and celebrate Brendan's big day. I hit send. I set the phone down and looked at the forensic team. I told them the bait was set. Now it was time to spring the trap. I turned back to the projected screen showing the fraudulent bank transfers. I pointed to the dummy corporation my brother used to funnel the stolen pension money. I told David to isolate every single account attached to that corporation. I wanted every routing number, every hidden offshore account, and every corporate credit card my father had issued to Brendan and Chloe. We spent the next 3 hours compiling a massive, undeniable mountain of legal evidence. We printed out hundreds of pages of financial logs, wire transfer receipts, and forged invoices. We bound them into a thick, heavy red folder. This folder was not just an audit. It was an absolute financial death warrant for my father and my brother. My parents thought I was a naive little girl who could be easily manipulated. They were about to learn what happens when you hand a trained corporate bookkeeper the keys to the entire kingdom. The next morning was Friday, the day of Brendan's lavish wedding rehearsal dinner. I sat in the private office Evelyn had assigned to me at the holding company headquarters. My grandfather's heavy black metal card rested on the desk right next to my laptop. The card had granted me full, unrestricted access to the highest levels of the corporate banking structure. I was officially recognized as the majority shareholder and the sole executive authority over the logistics firm. That meant I possessed the absolute legal right to control the flow of every single dollar in the company. Evelyn walked into the office carrying a stack of authorization forms. She looked at me with a sharp professional intensity. She told me the wedding vendors were expecting their final payments by noon today. The country club required a $25,000 deposit for the catering alone. The florist, the band, and the custom dress designer were all scheduled to run their final charges against my father's corporate credit cards within the next 2 hours. I opened the master banking portal on my laptop. The screen displayed the primary operating accounts for the logistics company, along with the specific accounts my father had been using to embezzle the pension funds. I could see the pending transactions lining up in the queue. There was a charge for $5,000 from a luxury imported flower vendor. There was a charge for $8,000 from an exclusive bridal boutique. Brendan and Chloe were spending the stolen retirement money of hardworking people to buy themselves a fantasy weekend. I placed my hand on the computer mouse. I asked Evelyn to confirm that the legal freeze orders were fully prepared. She nodded and placed a signed judicial injunction on my desk. She explained that because we had definitive proof of active embezzlement, we had the legal right to enact an immediate total asset freeze to prevent the further destruction of company funds. Once the freeze was initiated, my father would have absolutely no access to any corporate cash. His company credit cards would be instantly declined. Brendan's dummy corporation accounts would be completely locked. The flow of stolen money would be permanently severed. I looked at the screen. I thought about my mother draining my $15,000 while I stood crying on her porch. I thought about my father telling me I was a selfish burden. I thought about Brendan constantly taking whatever he wanted without a single ounce of guilt. For my entire life, I had been the one making sure their bills were paid on time. I was the one who went without, so they could have everything. I clicked the mouse. A prompt appeared on the screen asking for executive authorization to freeze all selected accounts. I entered my secure credentials. I typed in my full name. I hit enter. The banking portal refreshed. A solid red banner appeared across the top of the dashboard. All accounts were officially locked. The corporate credit cards were instantly deactivated. The dummy accounts were completely frozen. The financial lifeblood of my father's criminal enterprise was abruptly and entirely cut off. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The sheer power of that single click sent a rush of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. It was done. They had absolutely nothing left. Almost immediately, the chaos began to unfold from afar. Evelyn's phone started buzzing with notifications from the bank. The automated system was reporting a massive cascade of declined transactions. The country club catering charge was rejected due to insufficient funds. The imported florist charge was denied. The bridal boutique payment bounced. I sat in the quiet safety of my office and simply watched the notifications roll in. I could clearly picture the scene playing out across town. I knew my father was probably standing at a cash register right now, angrily demanding that the merchant run his card again. I knew Chloe was likely throwing a massive tantrum in a bridal shop because her custom alterations were suddenly halted. I knew Brendan was frantically trying to log into his dummy accounts, only to find a glaring red error message telling him his access was permanently revoked. They were experiencing the exact same terror and humiliation they had forced upon me just a few nights ago. But unlike me, they actually deserved it. Evelyn smiled and gathered the authorization forms from my desk. She told me the trap was perfectly set. My parents still firmly believed they were in complete control. They still thought I was walking blindly into their rehearsal dinner tonight to sign my grandfather's empire away. They had no idea that their accounts were already dead. They had no idea that the money they were planning to use to impress Chloe's wealthy family was entirely gone. I picked up the heavy red folder containing the forensic audit and the proof of their embezzlement. I tucked it carefully into my leather tote bag. I stood up and smoothed the front of my new tailored suit. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. I was no longer the frightened, exhausted girl shivering in a wet jacket in a cheap motel parking lot. I was the sole owner of a $32 million estate. I was the boss of the company they had been stealing from, and I was going to walk into that luxurious country club tonight and hand them the bill for everything they had done. I looked at Evelyn and told her it was time to go to a wedding rehearsal. The golden child was about to find out exactly what happens when the invisible bookkeeper decides to stop paying the tab. The Friday night air was crisp and completely clear. It was a stark contrast to the freezing rainstorm that had nearly broken me just a few days prior. I stepped out of the tinted luxury SUV and looked up at the grand entrance of the Oak Creek Country Club. The building was a massive, sprawling estate surrounded by manicured golf courses and towering oak trees. Soft yellow light spilled from the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the main ballroom. I could hear the faint, elegant sound of a live string quartet drifting through the heavy wooden doors. This was exactly the kind of place my parents loved. It was a place designed to make people feel wealthy, important, and entirely above the rules. I did not look like the exhausted, invisible bookkeeper they had thrown onto a muddy porch. Evelyn had arranged for a personal stylist. I wore a tailored charcoal gray suit that fit me perfectly, expensive leather heels, and my hair was styled in a sleek, confident blowout. More importantly, I was not alone. 2 highly trained private security contractors in dark suits walked closely on either side of me. They were large, silent, and incredibly imposing. They were instructed not to speak, but simply to ensure that no one laid a single hand on me. We walked past the valet stand and stepped through the polished brass doors of the country club. The main ballroom was a display of absolute sickening excess. There were towering floral arrangements of white roses and orchids on every single table. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over dozens of guests wearing designer cocktail attire. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the room, carrying silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Across the room, I spotted my brother Brendan and his fiancée Chloe. They were standing near an ice sculpture, laughing loudly and holding court with Chloe's wealthy old money parents. Brendan wore a custom tuxedo that I knew had been purchased with stolen retirement funds. Chloe wore a silk designer dress, tossing her head back and smiling as if she were royalty holding a grand reception. Then I saw my parents. Richard and Patricia were standing near the private bar. They looked tense. My father kept checking his watch, his jaw tightly clenched. My mother was nervously twisting the heavy gold bracelet around her wrist. They were waiting for their trap to spring. They were waiting for their naive, obedient daughter to walk in so they could steal $32 million. My mother spotted me first. Her eyes widened, taking in my tailored suit and the 2 massive security guards standing right behind my shoulders. She quickly masked her surprise with a bright, entirely fake smile. She tapped my father on the arm and pointed in my direction. Together they hurried across the polished hardwood floor, completely ignoring the other guests. "Hannah, sweetheart," my mother practically sang as she approached. She reached out to hug me, but one of my security guards took a single deliberate step forward. My mother froze her arms, dropping awkwardly to her sides. She cleared her throat and tried to maintain her cheerful facade. "We are so incredibly glad you decided to come, honey. We knew you would do the right thing." My father stood beside her, forcing a rigid smile. "We just want to put all that silly drama behind us, Hannah," he said, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We are a family. Family always comes first. We forgive you for being so stubborn the other night. We just want to be a happy family again." I looked at them. I did not smile. I did not nod. I just stared directly into my father's eyes. It was truly fascinating to watch them lie so effortlessly. "Anyway," my mother said, her voice raising a pitch in nervous energy. She quickly unclasped her designer purse. "Before we sit down to enjoy this beautiful dinner, your father and I just need to get some boring legal housekeeping out of the way. We told you about those routine tax papers on the voicemail. It will only take 2 seconds of your time." She pulled a thick cream-colored document from her purse. It was the exact same type of envelope I had seen in my grandfather's safe room. She also pulled out a heavy silver pen. She held the document and the pen out toward me, pushing them insistently toward my chest. "Just sign right here on the bottom line, Hannah," my father urged, tapping his finger against the signature block. It is just a standard release form to close out one of Grandpa Harrison's old empty checking accounts. Once you sign it, we can all sit down, drink some champagne, and celebrate Brendan's big weekend. I looked down at the document. I could clearly read the bold legal print at the top of the page. It was a formal waiver of beneficiary rights. It was the exact document that would transfer my entire $32 million inheritance directly into their hands. They thought I was too stupid to read it. They thought I was too desperate for their love to question them. I looked from the document back to my mother's expectant face. "I do not think I will be signing that," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the ballroom with absolute clarity. My mother's fake smile twitched. "Hannah, do not start this again," she hissed, dropping the sweet tone completely. "We are in public. Do not cause a scene in front of Chloe's family. Just sign the paper." "I am not causing a scene," I replied evenly. "I am simply refusing to sign away the Harrison Trust." The color drained instantly from my father's face. He looked as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but he could not form a single word. My mother gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. They realized in that exact second that I knew everything. They realized their trap had completely failed. "You cannot force me to sign away my grandfather's company," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "And you are going to need a lot more than my signature to save yourselves from what is about to happen." Before my father could recover enough to shout, a man in a sharp black suit approached our group. He was the general manager of the country club. He carried a leather billfold and looked extremely uncomfortable. He stopped right beside my father and cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me, Mr. Myers." The manager said, his tone low and discreet. "I am so sorry to interrupt your evening. However, we have encountered a highly unusual problem with your payment for tonight's event." My father turned to the manager, his eyes wide with sudden panic. "What are you talking about? I gave you the corporate card an hour ago." "Yes, sir," the manager replied, shifting his weight. "And we ran the card for the $25,000 catering bill. Unfortunately, the transaction was completely declined by your bank. The terminal states that the account has been entirely frozen." My father sputtered. "That is impossible. That is a corporate account with unlimited credit. Run it again. You must have typed the numbers wrong." "We have run it 3 times, sir." The manager insisted, his voice growing slightly louder. "I also attempted to run the secondary backup card you provided for the floral arrangements. That card was also declined. Sir, we cannot serve the main course until the balance is settled in full." My father frantically dug into his wallet, his hands shaking violently. He pulled out 3 different credit cards and shoved them into the manager's hands. "Run all of these," he demanded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Run every single one of them." The manager nodded tightly and hurried back toward the club offices. By now, the commotion had attracted the attention of the surrounding guests. People were stopping their conversations to stare at our group. Brendan and Chloe, noticing the sudden tension, walked over from the ice sculpture. Chloe's wealthy parents followed closely behind them, wearing expressions of mild distaste. "What is going on?" Brendan demanded, looking back and forth between my sweating father and my perfectly calm face. "Why is the manager bothering you about the bill?" My mother tried to laugh it off, but the sound was choked and frantic. "It is nothing, Brendan. Just a silly computer glitch at the bank. Your father is fixing it right now." But Chloe's mother, a woman dripping in diamonds, narrowed her eyes. "A glitch?" she asked coldly. "They are holding up the dinner service over a glitch." The club manager returned faster than expected. He did not look polite anymore. He looked irritated. He handed the stack of credit cards back to my father. "Sir, every single card has been declined," the manager announced, speaking loud enough for the entire circle to hear. "The bank fraud department has attached a hard lock to your entire financial profile. We need alternative payment immediately, or I will have to ask your guests to vacate the dining room." Chloe let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She grabbed Brendan's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Brendan, what is he talking about?" she shrieked. "Why are your parents' credit cards declining? You told me they were paying for the entire weekend." Brendan turned to my father, his face flushing bright red with embarrassment. Dad, fix this right now. Chloe's entire family is watching us. Hand him another card. I do not have another card, my father yelled, finally losing control. He turned his furious, bloodshot eyes on me. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. You did this. You went to the bank. You triggered the lock on the accounts. Yes, I did, I said calmly, stepping forward so that my voice would carry across the silent, staring crowd. My father lost his mind. He lunged toward me, raising his hand as if he were going to physically grab me by the throat. He screamed that I was an ungrateful, malicious thief. But before he could even close the distance, both of my security guards moved with terrifying speed. One guard stepped directly in front of me, forming a solid human wall. The other guard grabbed my father by the shoulders and forcefully shoved him backward. My father stumbled and crashed hard into a table covered in expensive champagne glasses. The glass shattered onto the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The string quartet stopped playing instantly. The entire ballroom fell into a state of absolute paralyzed shock. Guests gasped and stepped away from our group. Do not touch me, I warned my father, stepping around my security guard so the entire room could see me. I am not the thief here, Richard. Chloe was hyperventilating now. Her mother grabbed her hand, looking at my family as if we were diseased. What on earth is happening here? Chloe's father demanded, his face purple with outrage. Richard, why is your daughter treating you like a criminal? I turned to look directly at Chloe's wealthy, arrogant parents. I raised my voice so that every single guest in that lavish country club could hear the absolute truth. He is acting like a criminal because he is a criminal, I announced loudly. My father and my brother did not pay for this beautiful wedding rehearsal. They did not pay for Brendan's custom tuxedo, and they did not pay for these thousands of dollars worth of white roses. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy red folder containing the forensic audit. I held it up for the room to see. For the past 3 years, my father and my brother have been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the employee pension fund at their logistics company. I declared, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. They stole the retirement savings of hardworking truck drivers, mechanics, and warehouse workers. They laundered the money through fake consulting companies to fund Brendan's failed businesses and this luxurious lifestyle you are all enjoying tonight. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens right after a bomb goes off. That is a lie. Brendan screamed, his voice cracking with pure panic. She is crazy. She is making this all up because she is jealous. I opened the red folder and pulled out a stack of bank transfer records. I threw them onto the floor right at Brendan's feet. These are the routing numbers, I said coldly. These are the exact offshore accounts and the dummy corporations. I am the majority shareholder of the parent company now. I initiated a total asset freeze this afternoon to stop you from stealing another dime from those innocent workers. You are entirely broke, Brendan. There is no money left. Chloe let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She dropped Brendan's arm as if he had burned her. You lied to me, she shrieked, backing away from him. You told me your family was rich. You are paying for my wedding with stolen retirement money. Chloe, please, Brendan begged, reaching out for her. I can explain. We can fix this. Do not touch my daughter, Chloe's father roared, stepping between them. He turned to his wife, his face contorted with absolute disgust. Gather our family. We are leaving this place immediately. I will not have my daughter associated with a family of common thieves. Chloe ripped off her expensive engagement ring and threw it directly at Brendan's chest. It bounced off his lapel and rolled across the hardwood floor. She turned and ran out of the ballroom, sobbing hysterically. Her wealthy parents followed right behind her, shouting at their guests to leave the building. Within seconds, the grand ballroom descended into pure chaos. Guests were grabbing their coats and rushing toward the exits, desperate to escape the scandal. The country club manager was shouting into his radio for local police to arrive and handle the unpaid catering bill. Brendan fell to his knees on the floor, staring at the discarded engagement ring. He looked up at my father, his face twisted with a mixture of terror and furious betrayal. You ruined my life, Brendan screamed at our father, completely abandoning his loyalty. You told me we would never get caught. You told me the money was perfectly hidden. You ruined everything." My father ignored him. He was staring at me, his chest heaving, his perfect wealthy facade completely annihilated. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, covering her face with her hands, realizing that she was no longer the respected matriarch of a successful family. She was just the wife of a desperate thief. I looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the crying golden child, and the parents who had once locked me out in the freezing rain. They had nothing left. The money was gone. The reputation was destroyed. The wedding was canceled. I turned to my security guards. "We are done here," I said quietly. I turned my back on my screaming family and walked out of the country club. I stepped out into the crisp, clear night air. For the first time in 28 years, I took a deep breath that belonged entirely to me. The war was far from over, but the invisible bookkeeper had just won the absolute greatest victory of her life. Monday morning brought a sharp and blinding sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my secure downtown penthouse. The pure adrenaline that had carried me through the weekend had completely worn off. I was sitting at the dining room table with Evelyn Hayes sipping black coffee and meticulously sorting through the final pages of my father's fraudulent corporate ledgers. We were preparing to hand the entire embezzlement file over to the district attorney later that afternoon. I thought the worst was finally over. I thought my parents had been completely defeated at the country club. I had absolutely no idea how deep their desperation truly ran. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, a heavy knock echoed from the front door of the penthouse. My private security guard, a massive man who had been stationed in the hallway all weekend, opened the door just a crack. A few seconds later, he walked into the dining room carrying a thick yellow envelope. He placed it directly on top of the financial ledgers. He told me a process server had just bypassed the lobby desk downstairs. Evelyn picked up the envelope. Her sharp professional demeanor instantly shifted into something incredibly tense. She broke the seal and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped by the county family court. She read the first page in total silence. I watched the color completely drain from her face. She set the papers down and looked at me with a terrifyingly serious expression. I asked her what my father was trying to do. I assumed he was filing a lawsuit to contest my grandfather's trust, or trying to sue me for defamation after I exposed him at the rehearsal dinner. Evelyn shook her head slowly. "It is much worse than a standard lawsuit," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Richard and Patricia have filed an emergency petition for an involuntary conservatorship. They are officially claiming that you have suffered a severe catastrophic mental breakdown. They are asking the judge to declare you legally incompetent and completely unfit to manage your own affairs or your inheritance." My heart stopped beating. The air in the penthouse suddenly felt overwhelmingly thin. I reached out and pulled the legal documents toward me. I read the petition line by line. It was a masterpiece of pure psychological manipulation. My parents had taken every single traumatic event they had personally caused over the past 4 days and masterfully twisted it to make me look like a deeply disturbed, dangerous young woman. The petition stated that I was suffering from sudden delusions of grandeur. They claimed I was hallucinating about inheriting a multi-million-dollar empire. They explicitly referenced the fact that I had been found sleeping in my freezing car in a cheap motel parking lot on Friday night. They conveniently omitted the fact that they were the ones who had locked me out in a rainstorm and drained my $15,000 life savings. Instead, they framed my homelessness as an erratic, manic episode. They described my appearance at Brendan's rehearsal dinner as a violent, psychotic break, claiming I burst into a peaceful family gathering screaming about stolen pensions and imaginary bank accounts. But the absolute worst part was the attached medical addendum. My father had used his wealthy country club connections to secure a sworn affidavit from a local highly paid psychiatrist. The doctor, who had never met me or spoken to me in his entire life, signed a preliminary statement suggesting that my sudden claims of corporate ownership and my extreme hostility toward my loving family were classic signs of early-onset schizophrenia. I dropped the papers onto the table. My hands were shaking so violently I could not even pick up my coffee mug. I looked at Evelyn and asked her how this was even legally possible. Evelyn leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an icy fury. "It is a very dirty, very desperate legal trick," she explained. "Richard knows he cannot beat the ironclad terms of your grandfather's trust. He knows the dead man's switch activated perfectly. So he is attacking the only vulnerability left. He is attacking your capacity to accept the inheritance. If a judge believes you are in the middle of a psychiatric crisis, the court will appoint a legal guardian to manage your finances for your own protection." Evelyn tapped her finger hard against my father's signature on the petition. "And as your next of kin, Richard is petitioning to be named your temporary conservator. If the judge grants this emergency order today, Richard gets immediate absolute control over the entire $32 million estate." The full horror of the situation crashed over me like a suffocating wave. If my father gained control of the trust, even for just a few days, he would have full access to the corporate holding company. He would immediately destroy the ledgers we had spent all weekend auditing. He would wire the stolen pension funds to hidden offshore accounts. He would wipe out every single piece of evidence proving his embezzlement, and he would leave dozens of innocent employees completely ruined. And worst of all, he would have the legal authority to lock me in a psychiatric facility just to keep me quiet. "We do not have time to panic," Evelyn said, snapping her briefcase shut and grabbing her coat. "The emergency hearing is scheduled for 11 o'clock this morning. We have exactly 90 minutes to get to the courthouse and stop your father from stealing your life and your freedom." We rushed out of the penthouse and climbed into the back of the waiting security vehicle. The drive to the county courthouse felt like a blur of sheer terror. I stared out the window at the passing city streets, my stomach twisting into painful knots. I had survived being thrown out into the mud. I had survived the freezing cold. I had even survived confronting them in front of 50 wealthy strangers. But the thought of sitting in a courtroom and listening to a judge officially declare me crazy because of my parents' lies was almost too much to bear. We pulled up to the grand stone steps of the courthouse. The building loomed over us, heavy and intimidating. Evelyn walked right beside me, her posture radiating absolute legal authority, while my 2 private security guards flanked us closely. We pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked down the long, echoing corridor toward the family court division. When we entered the small, wood-paneled courtroom, my parents were already sitting at the petitioner's table. They looked absolutely perfect. My father wore a conservative, somber gray suit. My mother wore a modest navy dress, holding a crumpled tissue in her hand. They looked exactly like heartbroken, terrified parents who were just trying to save their sick daughter. Sitting next to them was a man who practically oozed sleazy confidence. He was a high-priced litigation attorney named Gregory Stone. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a condescending smile. When he saw me walk into the courtroom with Evelyn, his smile widened just a fraction. He looked at me, not as a person, but as a very easy payday. I took my seat at the respondent's table next to Evelyn. I kept my back completely straight. I refused to look at my mother even when I heard her let out a loud theatrical sob. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened and Judge Caldwell walked into the room. He was an older, stern-looking man who immediately commanded absolute silence. He sat down, adjusted his reading glasses, and opened the thick file containing my father's petition. The judge looked directly at Gregory Stone and told him to proceed with the emergency motion. Stone stood up and slowly buttoned his jacket. He spoke with a smooth, deeply sympathetic voice that made my skin crawl. "Your Honor, we are here today under the most tragic and urgent of circumstances," he began, gesturing vaguely toward my parents. "My clients are simply trying to save the life of their eldest daughter, Hannah. Over the past 72 hours, she has suffered a catastrophic break from reality." Stone began to weave a narrative so distorted and convincing that I almost felt dizzy listening to it. He told the judge that I had been acting erratically for months, struggling under the normal pressures of my bookkeeping job. He claimed that the stress of my brother's upcoming wedding had finally pushed me over the edge. He presented the judge with the motel receipt from Friday night, painting a sad picture of a confused young woman who wandered out into a rainstorm and chose to sleep in her car rather than stay in her loving family home. Then Stone moved on to the money. He explained that my late grandfather had recently passed, leaving behind a modest, complicated estate. He told the judge that my fragile mind had latched onto this event and spun it into a massive paranoid delusion. Your Honor, on Friday evening, Hannah burst into a peaceful family dinner at a local country club, Stone said, lowering his voice for dramatic effect. She was accompanied by armed guards she hired while in a manic state. She began screaming wildly at the wedding guests. She claimed she had suddenly inherited $32 million. She claimed she owned her father's successful logistics company. She shouted bizarre conspiracy theories about stolen pensions and hidden bank accounts. It was a deeply disturbing scene completely detached from reality. My mother let out another perfectly timed sob. She buried her face in her hands. My father placed a comforting arm around her shoulders, looking up at the judge with an expression of pure, exhausted sorrow. Stone picked up the forged psychiatric evaluation and held it out. We have a preliminary assessment from Dr. William Davis, a highly respected psychiatrist in this county. Based on the overwhelming evidence of her erratic behavior, her homelessness and her severe delusions of sudden extreme wealth, Dr. Davis strongly recommends an immediate 30-day psychiatric hold and a temporary financial conservatorship. We are simply asking the court to grant Richard temporary control of Hannah's affairs so he can protect her credit and get his sick little girl the medical help she desperately needs. Stone sat down looking extremely satisfied with his performance. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I looked up at Judge Caldwell. The judge was staring at me with an expression of deep paternal pity. He was completely buying the story. He saw a well-dressed, heartbroken mother and a successful father begging to help their disturbed child. He saw a doctor's signature confirming my insanity. Judge Caldwell folded his hands on top of the bench. He looked over at Evelyn and me. This is a very compelling and troubling petition, the judge said slowly. The primary duty of this court is to ensure the safety of vulnerable individuals. In cases where sudden severe delusions are present, a temporary 30-day freeze of all assets under the father's supervision is standard procedure to preserve the status quo until a full medical evaluation can be completed. My heart plummeted into my stomach. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. A temporary 30-day freeze under my father's supervision meant he would get the keys to everything. He would walk out of this courthouse drive straight to the holding company and burn every single piece of evidence proving he had stolen millions from his employees. He would empty the trust my grandfather had hidden for me. He would destroy my life forever, and he would do it all with the full blessing of the legal system. I looked at my parents. My father was staring right back at me. A tiny, triumphant smirk flickered across his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally forced the invisible bookkeeper back into her proper place. But he had completely underestimated the woman sitting next to me. Evelyn Hayes did not look panicked. She did not look defeated. She calmly opened her leather briefcase, pulled out a massive stack of heavily watermarked financial documents, and stood up from the table. The real courtroom battle was just about to begin. Evelyn Hayes did not just stand up from our table. She commanded the entire room. She buttoned her tailored suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion that instantly drew every eye in the courtroom. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her mere presence was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. I watched Gregory Stone, the highly paid litigation attorney sitting next to my parents, physically shift uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. He knew the weather in the room had just changed. Your Honor. Evelyn began, her voice echoing clearly and firmly off the polished wood-paneled walls. Mr. Stone has woven a very tragic and compelling story for you this morning. He has painted a deeply moving picture of a devoted, wealthy family desperately trying to save a beloved daughter who has suddenly lost her mind. It is a beautiful story. Unfortunately for his clients, it is a complete and utter fabrication entirely designed to obscure a massive, ongoing criminal enterprise. Judge Caldwell frowned deeply, his thick gray eyebrows drawing together in stern warning. Counsel, those are incredibly severe accusations, he warned, leaning forward over the heavy mahogany bench. You had better be prepared to back them up right now. Evelyn walked calmly back to our table and picked up a heavy black binder. I am entirely prepared. Your Honor, she said, handing the thick binder to the bailiff to pass up to the judge. Let us start with the outrageous claim that my client Hannah suffered a sudden manic episode at a local bank on Friday morning. Mr. Stone conveniently left out the actual reason she was at that bank and the terrifying reason she required armed private security afterward. Evelyn turned and nodded toward me. On Friday morning, my client discovered that her parents, Richard and Patricia Myers, had maliciously drained her entire life savings of $15,000 and locked her out of her childhood home during a freezing rainstorm, all because she refused to pay for her brother's lavish wedding dinner. She went to Cumberland National Trust simply to access a dormant account left by her late grandfather. When she did, an automated legal alert was triggered. The judge flipped open the heavy binder, his eyes rapidly scanning the top documents. Included in that primary exhibit, Your Honor, is the verified security footage and the official incident report from the bank manager. Evelyn continued pacing slowly in front of the bench. You will see clearly that Hannah was not acting erratically. She was completely terrified. And she was terrified because Richard immediately dispatched a private investigator to the bank to physically corner her. The investigator aggressively attempted to breach the secure back offices. The bank staff actually had to initiate a full emergency lockdown just to protect my client from her own father. My father jumped up from his chair, his face flushing an angry, violent crimson. That is a total lie, he shouted, waving his hands. I was just worried about her safety. I wanted to bring her home. Sit down, Mr. Myers. Judge Caldwell snapped, banging his heavy wooden gavel once against the sounding block. Do not speak out of turn in my courtroom again. My father slowly sank back into his seat, his jaw clenching tightly. Gregory Stone looked down at his yellow legal pad, suddenly very quiet and very tense. Evelyn did not even blink at the interruption. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single cream-colored document. If Richard was simply worried about his daughter's mental health, Your Honor, I would like the court to closely examine the document he ambushed her with at a crowded country club rehearsal dinner just 24 hours later. She handed the document to the bailiff, who quickly passed it up to the bench. This is the exact paper Richard and Patricia shoved into my client's hands while she was surrounded by 50 wealthy wedding guests. They smiled and told her it was just a routine tax form. They begged her to sign it quickly so they could all be a happy family again. But as you can clearly read, Your Honor, it is not a tax form. It is a legally binding waiver of beneficiary rights. Judge Caldwell read the document carefully. I watched his face begin to change. The soft paternal pity he had shown my parents just 10 minutes ago was rapidly vanishing. It was being entirely replaced by a cold, rigid realization that he was being manipulated. My client is the sole legal heir to her grandfather's $32 million estate, Evelyn stated, her voice ringing like a clear bell through the silent room. Richard was not trying to get his daughter psychiatric help. He was trying to trick her into signing away a massive corporate empire before she even understood what she rightfully owned. And when that public ambush failed miserably, he rushed straight to this court to have her declared incompetent so he could seize absolute control of the assets himself. My mother started to cry again, but the sound was thin and panicky. It did not have the same theatrical, polished grief it had earlier. Judge Caldwell did not even look at her. He was staring directly at Gregory Stone. Mr. Stone, the judge said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low register. Did you know your clients attempted to force the respondent to sign a waiver of a $32 million estate while simultaneously preparing to file a medical competency petition against her? Gregory Stone actually swallowed hard. He tugged nervously at his crisp, white collar. Your Honor, I was not aware of any specific documents presented at the country club event. I was only retained for this emergency medical petition based on their sworn statements. Evelyn stepped right back into the center of the room. She was not finished. She had not even delivered the fatal blow yet. The attempt to steal the inheritance is egregious, Your Honor, Evelyn said, gripping the edge of the wooden podium. But it is not the actual reason Richard is so utterly desperate to take control of my client today. The real reason is what my client discovered when she took legal control of the parent holding company and audited the corporate books all weekend long. Evelyn walked back to our table and picked up the thick red folder. The folder containing the forensic accounting we had stayed up all night compiling. She carried it to the bailiff like it was a loaded weapon. "Your Honor, my client is a highly trained corporate bookkeeper," Evelyn announced, turning to look directly at my father. When she examined the raw ledgers of the logistics company her father manages, she uncovered a massive systematic financial fraud. Richard and his son Brendan have been actively embezzling millions of dollars from the employee pension fund. The entire courtroom seemed to gasp at the exact same time. My father turned the color of wet ash. He grabbed the edge of the defendant table, his knuckles turning completely white as he stared at the red folder in horror. They have been maliciously siphoning the retirement savings of innocent truck drivers, mechanics and warehouse workers, routing the stolen money through dummy corporations and using it to fund luxury vehicles, failed tech startups, and a $100,000 country club wedding, Evelyn continued, her voice echoing with absolute righteous authority. The undeniable proof is in that red folder. Bank routing numbers, forged vendor invoices, and hidden offshore account transfers. Judge Caldwell opened the heavy red folder. The silence in the room was completely suffocating. I watched the judge read the top summary page. I watched his eyes scan the highlighted stolen numbers. I watched a man who had dedicated his entire life to the law realize that the weeping mother and the concerned father sitting in his courtroom were actually vicious, calculating predators who were actively destroying the lives of working-class families. The transformation in Judge Caldwell was genuinely terrifying. His face turned a deep, mottled, angry red. His jaw set into hard stone. He looked up from the red folder and stared directly at my father. The air in the room felt like it was going to catch fire. Judge Caldwell slowly closed the red folder and placed his hands flat on top of it. He did not speak immediately. He just stared at my parents with a look of such profound, absolute disgust that I actually felt a shiver run down my own spine. When he finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of any warmth or judicial neutrality. It was the harsh, booming voice of absolute judgment. "Mr. Myers," the judge said, his words slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom like a surgical scalpel. "You came into my courtroom this morning and explicitly asked me to strip a young woman of her basic civil liberties. You looked me directly in the eye and swore under oath that your daughter was suffering from a catastrophic break from reality. You used her homelessness, a tragic condition this court now clearly understands you directly and maliciously caused, as manufactured proof of her insanity." My father tried to speak, his hands shaking wildly. "Your Honor, please. You have to understand those financial documents are entirely out of context." She is confused. "Do not interrupt me," Judge Caldwell roared, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with incredible force. The loud, violent crack made my mother physically jump in her chair and let out a frightened squeak. "You do not get to speak, Mr. Myers. You do not get to spin any more lies in this room today." The judge turned his blazing, furious eyes toward Gregory Stone. The expensive litigation attorney looked like he wanted to sink right through the floorboards and disappear forever. "Mr. Stone," the judge continued, his tone laced with heavy venom, "your clients willfully attempted to use this court as a blunt weapon to facilitate a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. They submitted a preliminary medical evaluation based entirely on fabricated symptoms and intentionally manipulated circumstances. They attempted to subvert the legal system to cover up their own massive, ongoing embezzlement. This is an absolute disgrace to the judicial process and a mockery of this court. Your Honor, I assure you I had absolutely no knowledge of these underlying financial irregularities," Stone stammered, raising his hands defensively in the air. "I relied entirely and completely on the sworn statements of my clients regarding the respondents' declining mental health. You had better pray the State Ethics Board believes that Counsel Judge Caldwell shot back, his voice echoing loudly, because this behavior borders on an active criminal conspiracy." The judge picked up his silver pen and pulled my father's desperate competency petition toward him. He slashed a heavy dark line diagonally across the front page, pressing so hard I thought the pen might break. "The emergency petition for a temporary medical conservatorship is hereby dismissed with extreme prejudice," Judge Caldwell announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. This court finds absolutely zero credible evidence to suggest that Hannah is anything other than fully competent, entirely rational, and acting intelligently in the best interest of the estate she has rightfully inherited. I let out a long, shaky breath. I felt like I had been holding for my entire 28 years of life. The heavy, crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest since they locked me out in the rain finally evaporated into thin air. I was completely safe. They could not lock me away in a hospital. They could not silence me. But the furious judge was not finished. Furthermore, Judge Caldwell continued leaning forward over the bench and pointing a stern, rigid finger directly at my parents. Based on the overwhelming and highly disturbing financial evidence presented in this red folder, I am taking immediate legal action to protect the respondent and the massive corporate assets she currently controls. I am issuing an emergency immediate restraining order against Richard and Patricia Myers. My mother let out a loud, hysterical, wailing cry. "Richard, you cannot let him do this," she sobbed violently, clutching his suit arm. "Tell him he's wrong. We are a good family." My father just sat there completely paralyzed and silent. His eyes were wide and vacant, staring at nothing. He was finally realizing that there was absolutely no way out of this trap. The golden protective walls he had built around his perfect, wealthy life were crashing down right on top of his head. "You are both strictly ordered to stay at least 500 yards away from Hannah, her personal residence, and any corporate offices associated with the Harrison Trust," the judge commanded loudly. "If you attempt to contact her by any means, if you attempt to send another private investigator to harass her, or if you attempt to interfere with her legal management of this estate in any capacity whatsoever, I will personally see to it that you are instantly jailed for contempt of court." The judge then picked up the thick red folder containing the forensic audit of the stolen employee pension funds. He looked over at the armed bailiff standing at attention near the front of the room. "Bailiff, I want this specific folder heavily secured right now." Judge Caldwell ordered, handing the documents over the bench. "I am officially forwarding these financial records directly to the district attorney's office this afternoon. I am formally requesting an immediate high-priority criminal investigation into Richard Myers and Brendan Myers for corporate embezzlement, systemic wire fraud, and the grand theft of employee pension funds." The terrifying words hit the quiet courtroom like a physical shockwave. Criminal investigation, wire fraud, grand theft. My father was not just going to lose his comfortable job and his prestigious country club reputation. He was going to face severe federal prison time. He was going to stand trial for stealing the life savings of the vulnerable people who worked tirelessly for him. The arrogant man who had thrown me out like worthless trash was about to lose his absolute freedom. "Court is officially adjourned," Judge Caldwell declared, striking his wooden gavel one final heavy time. He stood up from his tall leather chair, turned his back completely on my weeping parents, and walked briskly out through the heavy wooden door behind the bench. The exact moment the judge left the room, Gregory Stone stood up from the petitioner's table. He did not say a single comforting word to my parents. He snapped his expensive briefcase shut, turned quickly on his heel, and walked rapidly out of the courtroom, clearly desperate to distance his legal career from the toxic radioactive fallout of my father's massive crimes. My parents were left sitting entirely alone at the large wooden table. Without their lawyer and without their stolen money, they looked incredibly small, broken, and pathetic. My mother was weeping openly, her face completely buried in her shaking hands. My father just stared blankly at the empty space where his high-priced lawyer had been sitting just seconds before. I stood up slowly from my chair. I gathered my purse and the encrypted laptop Evelyn had given me. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world. I looked at the people who had treated me like a useless burden my entire life, who had stolen my hard-earned money, kicked me into the freezing cold, and tried to have me declared insane just to protect their own insatiable greed. I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. No pity, no sadness, no lingering desire for their approval. Just a profound, sweeping emptiness that felt incredibly clean. Evelyn touched my arm gently. "Are you ready to go home, Hannah?" she asked, her voice filled with quiet, deep respect. I looked at the brilliant woman who had helped me fight the hardest battle of my entire life. I looked at the private security guards waiting to escort me safely out of the building. I thought about the $32 million empire waiting for me to finally rebuild it properly. I thought about the hardworking employees whose stolen pensions I was going to fully restore. Yes, I said, smiling genuinely for the first time in days. I am finally ready to go home. I turned my back on Richard and Patricia Myers forever, and I walked proudly out of the courtroom. I walked out through the heavy doors and into the bright, clear Ohio sunlight, a completely free woman. My life was entirely my own now, and I was going to build something truly beautiful with it. The Tuesday morning air was biting and bitter as it whipped off the gray Ohio River. I stood on the sidewalk outside the towering glass and steel headquarters of Harrison Logistics. For my entire life, this massive building had been a monument to my father. It was his kingdom. It was the fortress he retreated to every morning to build the wealth he used to control our family. I had never been allowed past the front lobby. He always told me I did not belong in a place of serious business. Today, I was walking in as the sole legal owner of the entire operation. I wore a sharp-tailored navy blue suit. My posture was perfectly straight. Evelyn Hayes walked on my right side, carrying a thick leather briefcase packed with court-stamped documents. Thomas Sterling walked on my left, his presence adding an undeniable weight of financial authority. Two heavily armed private security contractors followed closely behind us. We pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate marble lobby. The receptionist at the front desk looked up and immediately froze. Her hand hovered nervously over the telephone. She had obviously been given strict instructions regarding my arrival. Before she could even lift the receiver, Evelyn stepped forward and placed a heavy legal injunction flat on the counter. She instructed the receptionist to remain completely silent and not to touch the phone. We bypassed the security turnstiles and stepped into the private executive elevator. I pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried us upward. My stomach fluttered with a nervous energy, but my mind was entirely clear. The terrified, obedient girl who used to balance my parents' checkbook for free was completely gone. The woman riding up to the executive boardroom was the new majority shareholder, and she was absolutely ready for war. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. We stepped out onto the plush carpet of the executive suite. Down the hallway, the heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom were wide open. I could hear my father's voice echoing down the corridor. He was speaking loudly, trying to sound incredibly confident and commanding. I walked quietly down the hall and stopped just outside the doorway. I looked inside. My father, Richard, was standing at the head of a massive mahogany table. The room was packed. 12 senior executives and board directors were seated around the table looking incredibly tense and deeply uncomfortable. My brother Brendan sat near my father wearing a cheap suit and sweating profusely. Brendan kept wiping his forehead with a crumpled napkin. My father was leaning over the table, gesturing wildly with his hands. He was telling them a completely fabricated story. I listened as he loudly proclaimed that a terrible, tragic misunderstanding had occurred within the family. He told the board of directors that his troubled daughter had suffered a severe mental breakdown and was currently trying to use forged legal documents to disrupt company operations. He assured the executives that his lawyers were handling the situation and that he remained in absolute control of the firm. He instructed them that if I attempted to enter the building, they were to immediately call the police and have me arrested for criminal trespassing. I did not wait for him to finish his speech. I stepped squarely into the doorway of the boardroom. "I am afraid your legal updates are completely inaccurate, Richard," I said. My voice was calm, clear, and loud enough to stop every single conversation in the room. 12 senior executives snapped their heads toward the door. My father froze mid-sentence. The false bravado completely drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, terrified mask. Brendan actually whimpered and pushed his chair back away from the table. My father pointed a shaking finger at me. "How did you get up here?" he demanded, his voice cracking with panic. He looked past me and saw the private security contractors. He started screaming for the building guards. "Call security right now," he yelled at the executives. "Have this woman removed from my building. She is having a psychotic episode." Not a single executive moved. They were all staring at the thick leather briefcase Evelyn Hayes was unbuckling. Evelyn walked directly to the center of the mahogany table. She pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bearing the heavy gold seal of the county court. She dropped them onto the polished wood. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. "My name is Evelyn Hayes," she announced, looking around the table with piercing authority. "I am the senior estate attorney for the Harrison Trust. I am accompanied by Thomas Sterling, the branch manager of Cumberland National Trust. These documents are finalized, court-approved orders, signed by Judge Caldwell yesterday afternoon. They verify that the late William Harrison was the sole owner of the parent company that funds this entire logistics operation. Furthermore, they verify that 100% of the Harrison estate has legally transferred to his granddaughter, Hannah Myers." Evelyn paused, letting the immense weight of her words settle over the stunned executives. "Hannah Myers is the new majority shareholder," Evelyn stated firmly. "She is the absolute legal owner of this building, the fleet of trucks, and every single corporate account associated with this firm. Richard Myers is merely an operating manager, and as of this exact moment, he holds absolutely no authority in this room." I walked slowly past my father. He was gripping the back of his chair, completely paralyzed by shock. I walked straight to the head of the mahogany table. I pulled out the large leather chair that he had just been standing behind. I sat down. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked directly at the board of directors. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said smoothly. "We have a massive amount of corporate housekeeping to do today, and we are going to start by cleaning out the garbage." My father finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. His face turned a deep mottled purple. He slammed his fist down hard on the mahogany table, making several coffee cups rattle. "This is an absolute outrage," he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "I built this company from the ground up. I put 30 years of my blood and sweat into these warehouses. You cannot just walk in here and steal my life's work. You are nothing but an ungrateful, spiteful little girl trying to ruin your own family out of sheer jealousy." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I just watched him throw his pathetic tantrum. "You did not build anything," Richard White replied coldly. "My grandfather built this company. He allowed you to manage it because he wanted to give you a chance to be a decent man. But you spent the last 30 years treating his company the exact same way you treated me. You used it. You exploited it, and you assumed you would never be held accountable for your greed." I gestured to Evelyn. She walked over to the audio-visual controls set into the wall. She dimmed the overhead lights and turned on the large projector screen at the far end of the boardroom. I opened my secure laptop. I told the board of directors that they had been severely misled regarding the financial health of the company. I explained that my father had been presenting them with doctored profit and loss statements for the past 3 years. I clicked a button on my keyboard, and the real financial data flashed onto the massive screen. The first slide showed a complex web of automated bank transfers. I stood up and pointed to the screen. For the past 36 months, the operating manager of this firm, Richard Myers, has been systematically siphoning funds out of the employee pension accounts. I announced, my voice echoing in the dark room. He established a series of fake vendor accounts labeled as Logistics Consulting Services. These vendor accounts do not exist. They are dummy corporations owned entirely by his son, Brendan Myers. I clicked to the next slide. It displayed Brendan's personal bank statements perfectly matching the stolen amounts. The stolen retirement funds of your truck drivers, your mechanics, and your warehouse staff were directly funneled into Brendan's pockets. I continued mercilessly. This stolen money was used to finance luxury sports cars, expensive downtown apartments, and a lavish country club wedding that was abruptly canceled this past Friday. The reaction from this board of directors was immediate and explosive. A senior vice president named Marcus, a man who had worked for the company for 20 years, stood up from his chair. His face was completely white. "Richard, is this true?" Marcus demanded, his voice shaking with absolute fury. "You told us the pension deficits were due to market fluctuations. You told us the fund was recovering. Have you been stealing our retirement money?" My father backed away from the table. He looked around the room like a trapped animal. He tried to stammer out an excuse. He tried to say that it was just a temporary loan, that he was going to put the money back, that the numbers were completely taken out of context. But nobody was listening to him anymore. The executives were staring at the screen in pure horror. They realized that their own pensions, their own financial futures had been robbed by the man demanding their loyalty. The boardroom erupted into a chorus of angry shouts and demands for immediate answers. I struck the table hard with the flat of my hand. The loud crack silenced the room instantly. I looked directly at my father and my brother. "There will be no more lies told in this building," I declared. Richard Myers. Effective immediately, your employment at Harrison Logistics is permanently terminated. You are officially stripped of all managerial duties, all corporate access, and all executive privileges. Brendan Myers. Your fraudulent consulting contracts are terminated, and your corporate security clearance is permanently revoked. Brendan started to cry. He actually buried his face in his hands and sobbed right there in the boardroom. My father just stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly toward the door. Furthermore, I continued leaning forward over the table. I am officially initiating a massive civil lawsuit to claw back every single penny you stole from this company. The forensic audit files have already been handed over to the district attorney. You are not just fired, Richard. You are going to federal prison. My father lunged toward me. He was completely blinded by rage and desperation. He raised his hands, preparing to strike me right there in the boardroom. But my private security contractors were already moving. They intercepted him before he could even take 2 steps. They grabbed his arms, twisted them sharply behind his back, and pinned him forcefully against the wall. "Get your hands off me," my father screamed, kicking wildly at the security guards. "I am the boss. I am Richard Myers. You cannot do this to me. Remove them from my building," I ordered the guards. The security contractors dragged my screaming, thrashing father out of the boardroom and down the long executive hallway. Brendan scrambled out of his chair and ran after them, weeping loudly and apologizing to the executives as he fled. Their pathetic voices echoed down the corridor, growing fainter and fainter as the elevator doors finally closed behind them. The silence that fell over the boardroom was profound. The executives sat frozen in their chairs, staring at me with a mixture of absolute shock and deep respect. They had just watched a quiet, invisible bookkeeper completely dismantle a corrupt regime in less than 20 minutes. I sat back down in the heavy leather chair at the head of the table. I smoothed the front of my suit. I looked at the terrified men and women sitting around me. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting calm, absolute authority. "The pension fund will be fully restored using the liquid assets from the Harrison Trust. No employee will lose a single dollar of their hard-earned retirement. Now please open the operational files in front of you. We have a logistics company to run." Justice had finally been served. The people who threw me out in the cold were facing absolute ruin, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. I was finally home. This story proves that you can never let toxic people determine your worth. Even if your own family tries to break you down, you have the power to audit your life, gather your strength, and take back your kingdom. Never let anyone treat you like an invisible burden. Stand up, fight back, and reclaim your power. If you loved watching this arrogant father get exactly what he deserved, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories of justice. Drop a comment below and tell me what time it is right now and where you are watching this video from. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next story. Saturday morning arrived with bright and brilliant sunshine. It was the exact kind of picture-perfect weather my mother had prayed for over the past 6 months. It was supposed to be the day her golden child finally cemented his place in high society. It was supposed to be the day Brendan married Chloe in a spectacular $100,000 ceremony that would be photographed and envied by every single one of their wealthy friends. Instead, it was the day the entire illusion violently shattered into a million unfixable pieces. I woke up in the master bedroom of the secure, trust-funded penthouse. The heavy blackout curtains were drawn back, allowing the morning light to flood across the polished hardwood floors. I lay in bed for a long moment, simply listening to the absolute quiet. There was no one demanding that I get up and cook breakfast. There was no mother hovering in the doorway to remind me that I needed to move my rusty car out of the driveway so Brendan could park his luxury sports car. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely and utterly free from their control. I walked into the massive modern kitchen and poured myself a cup of dark roast coffee. As I sat down at the granite island, I finally looked at my cell phone. The screen was completely covered in notifications. There were dozens of missed calls from my father and my mother. There were frantic text messages from extended family members who had flown into town for the wedding. But what caught my attention was a single incredibly long voicemail from my brother Brendan. I took a sip of my coffee and pressed play. Brendan's voice filled the quiet kitchen. He was not using his usual arrogant, demanding tone. He sounded completely hysterical. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air between his words. "Hannah, please, you have to answer the phone," he sobbed. His voice was echoing slightly, and I could hear chaotic background noise behind him. The country club just locked us out. The manager changed the access codes to the bridal suite and told the security guards not to let us inside. Hannah the florist is literally loading the centerpieces back into their delivery trucks right now. The catering company dumped all the raw ingredients in the kitchen and walked out because the final wire transfer bounced. You have to fix this. You have to lift the freeze on the accounts. I set my coffee mug down and listened as the golden child completely unraveled. He did not apologize for stealing from innocent people. He did not express a single ounce of remorse for what he had done to me. Instead, he did exactly what entitled cowards always do when they are cornered. He threw the people who protected him right under the bus. "It was not my fault," Hannah Brendan pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. "It was Dad. Dad is the one who set up the dummy corporations. He is the one who showed me how to funnel the pension money. I did not even know it was illegal. He told me Grandpa left him the company and he could do whatever he wanted with the cash. You have to believe me. Do not let them do this to me. Chloe is going to be here in 20 minutes. Her parents paid for the private chartered bus for their guests, and they are arriving right now. Just unlock $50,000. That is all I need. Just unlock $50,000 so I can get married, and then you can take the company. Please, Hannah, do not ruin my life." The voicemail clicked and ended. I sat in the sunlight completely unfazed. I did not feel a single drop of pity for him. Brendan was a 30-year-old man who had spent his entire adult life riding on my back and stealing from working-class families to fund his pathetic delusions of grandeur. He knew exactly where that money was coming from. He just never cared who had to bleed so he could shine. I picked up my phone and deleted the voicemail. I did not reply. I turned the phone completely off and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows to watch the city wake up below me. I did not have to be at the country club to know exactly how the rest of that morning played out. My Aunt Eleanor, a woman who had always seen through my parents' lies, sent me a long, detailed email later that evening describing the absolute spectacular disaster of the century. According to Eleanor, Brendan was left standing in the country club parking lot in his rented custom tuxedo, sweating profusely and begging the venue manager to let them inside. My father and mother were frantically pacing the pavement, trying to dial my number over and over again. Then the private chartered bus arrived, carrying Chloe and her immensely wealthy old money parents. Chloe stepped off the bus in her custom silk gown, expecting to walk into a fairy tale. Instead, she walked into a crime scene. The venue doors were chained shut. The band was loading their instruments back into their vans, and Brendan was having a full-blown panic attack on the asphalt. When Chloe demanded to know what was happening, her father stepped forward. He had already made a few phone calls to his own corporate lawyers after the spectacular disaster at the rehearsal dinner the night before. He had verified every single thing I had said. He knew about the frozen accounts. He knew about the forensic audit. He knew about the impending federal investigation. Chloe's father stood in the middle of that parking lot and publicly confronted my father. He did not hold back. He loudly announced to the entire gathering of wedding guests that the Myers family was completely bankrupt and facing massive federal embezzlement charges. He pointed directly at Brendan and told his daughter that the man she was about to marry was a criminal who funded her engagement ring with stolen retirement money. Aunt Eleanor wrote that Chloe let out a scream that could shatter glass. She realized in front of all her friends and family that Brendan was not a wealthy tech entrepreneur. He was a fraud. His entire identity, his cars, his clothes, his charm, was entirely built on stolen money that he no longer had access to. Chloe did not even hesitate. She gathered the massive skirt of her silk wedding gown, turned her back on Brendan, and marched straight back onto the chartered bus. Her parents followed right behind her, ordering the driver to take them back to the hotel. Brendan tried to run after the bus, crying and shouting her name, but Chloe did not even look out the window. The golden child was left choking on exhaust fumes in a locked parking lot completely alone. He turned on my father, screaming and cursing at him right there in front of the remaining guests. The perfect, flawless family facade that my mother had spent decades meticulously constructing was dead and buried on the hot asphalt of the Oak Creek Country Club. While my family was busy tearing themselves apart in a public parking lot, I had real work to do. On Monday morning, I walked into the headquarters of Harrison Logistics. I did not walk in the back door. I walked straight through the front lobby as the undisputed legal owner of the company. Evelyn Hayes and my team of forensic accountants were waiting for me in the executive boardroom. The atmosphere in this building was incredibly tense. The employees had heard the rumors over the weekend. They knew something massive had shifted, but they did not know exactly what it meant for their jobs or their futures. I intended to show them exactly what kind of leader I was going to be. I spent the entire morning sitting with the accounting team going through the employee pension ledgers line by line. We identified every single dollar that my father and Brendan had siphoned out over the past 3 years. We calculated the missing interest, the lost dividends, and the exact financial damage inflicted on every single truck driver, mechanic, and warehouse worker. I authorized a direct massive transfer from the holding company's liquid trust assets. We did not just replace the stolen money. We replaced it with a generous compounded interest bonus to account for the risk and the betrayal they had unknowingly suffered. I personally signed the authorization forms guaranteeing that the retirement fund was permanently sealed, secured, and legally protected from any future executive tampering. I was sitting at the head of the mahogany table reviewing a stack of restored pension statements when Evelyn walked into the boardroom. She was holding her cell phone, and she had a look of profound, absolute satisfaction on her face. She walked over to my chair and placed the phone face down on the table. "The district attorney did not waste any time, Hannah," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with intensity. "The financial evidence you audited was too solid to ignore. They secured the warrants last night. The federal task force moved in 20 minutes ago. I stopped reviewing the documents." I looked up at her, feeling the heavy weight of the moment settle over the room. "They raided the house," Evelyn confirmed. "The FBI and the State Financial Crimes Unit just executed a simultaneous raid on your parents' suburban home and Brendan's downtown apartment." I sat back in my grandfather's heavy leather chair and let out a slow, deep breath. I could picture the scene with vivid, absolute clarity. The quiet, perfectly manicured suburban street where I had grown up suddenly swarming with federal agents in dark windbreakers. My mother standing on the front lawn, the lawn she cared about more than her own daughter, sobbing hysterically while all her judgmental neighborhood friends watched the spectacle from their porches. Evelyn read from the text message updates provided by our legal contacts at the courthouse. "They are seizing everything connected to the dummy corporations," she reported. "The federal agents are actively towing Brendan's luxury sports cars right out of the driveway. They are confiscating every computer, every hard drive, and every physical financial record inside the house. They have placed a complete federal lock on your parents' personal bank accounts, pending the grand jury indictment." The sheer poetic justice of it was almost overwhelming. Just 5 days ago, my father had stood in the warm, brightly lit hallway of that exact same house and pointed his finger at me. He had called me a selfish burden. He had ordered me to leave because I refused to hand over my life savings to fund his criminal lifestyle. My mother had stolen my $15,000 and left me to freeze in the mud. Now the federal government was walking through their front door and tearing their entire corrupt world down to the studs. They were experiencing the ultimate extreme version of the exact same financial terror they had gleefully inflicted upon me. The only difference was that I had been completely innocent. They were guilty of everything. They thought they were untouchable because they had money. They thought they could throw the quiet, invisible bookkeeper out into the trash, and she would simply vanish without a fight. They vastly underestimated the absolute destructive power of a woman who has finally stopped trying to earn love from people who are entirely incapable of giving it. I turned my attention back to the stack of pension documents sitting on the table in front of me. I picked up my pen. I did not feel sad for my father facing federal prison. I did not feel pity for my mother losing her prestigious neighborhood reputation. I did not care that my brother was currently sitting in an empty, raided apartment crying over a canceled wedding. I felt completely and entirely clean. The toxic poison that had infected my life for 28 years had finally been completely eradicated. I signed my name on the final authorization form, legally securing the futures of 300 innocent, hardworking families. I closed the folder and handed it to Evelyn. The golden child had fallen, and the invisible daughter was finally running the empire. 3 weeks can feel like an entire lifetime when you watch the world you knew completely turn upside down. In the 21 days following the federal raid on my parents' suburban home, my daily reality transformed into something I had only ever dreamed about. I was no longer the invisible bookkeeper working 60-hour weeks just to keep my head above water. I was the sole legal owner and majority shareholder of the Harrison Trust Holding Company. My days were spent sitting at the head of a mahogany table working alongside Evelyn Hayes and our forensic accounting team. We systematically traced every single stolen dollar and restored the employee pension fund entirely. Seeing the profound relief on the faces of the truck drivers and warehouse workers when we announced their retirement savings were fully secured was the greatest reward I could have ever asked for. But while my world was finally settling into a place of peace and absolute stability, my biological family was experiencing a rapid, terrifying freefall. The local news outlets had completely obsessed over the corporate scandal. The headlines were utterly relentless. They detailed the millions of dollars embezzled from hardworking blue-collar employees. They exposed the dummy corporations my father had set up to fund my brother Brendan's luxurious fake lifestyle. The federal authorities moved with absolute ruthless efficiency. The bank foreclosed on my parents' beautiful, perfect suburban home. All of their personal assets were entirely frozen pending the upcoming grand jury indictment. The high society friends who had eagerly attended Brendan's extravagant wedding rehearsal dinner completely vanished. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family facing massive federal wire fraud and grand theft charges. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the past finally caught up to me for the last time. A heavy gray storm had rolled into the city, bringing a freezing driving rain that felt incredibly familiar. I had just finished a long, productive meeting at the downtown branch of Cumberland National Trust. I thanked Thomas Sterling for his continuous support, gathered my heavy winter coat, and stepped out through the grand brass doors into the biting cold air. I pulled my collar tight against the wind and started walking toward my waiting private security vehicle. But as I moved down the wet concrete sidewalk, 2 figures stepped out from the deep shadows of the bank building. I stopped completely still. My security detail immediately stepped forward, but I raised my hand gently to hold them back. It was my mother and father, Richard and Patricia Myers. For a brief second, I did not even recognize them. The transformation was absolutely staggering. My father, a man who had always commanded every room he entered with his expensive tailored suits and intimidating posture, looked incredibly small. His shoulders were heavily slumped. His silver hair was unkempt and plastered to his forehead by the freezing rain. He wore a rumpled jacket that looked as though he had slept in it for days. My mother stood beside him looking completely broken. The pristine, wealthy matriarch, who had constantly judged my cheap clothes and worn expensive designer jewelry, was completely gone. Her face was pale and deeply lined. Her hands were shaking violently in the cold. They looked like 2 desperate, terrified strangers. "Hannah," my mother cried out, her voice cracking with pure, raw desperation. "Please wait. Please, you have to speak with us." I stood on the sidewalk, letting the freezing rain fall between us. I did not yell. I did not feel the sudden spike of anxiety that used to paralyze me whenever they raised their voices. I just looked at them with a calm, incredibly cold clarity. My mother took a hesitant step forward. The tears streaming down her face were not a theatrical performance this time. They were completely real. She was finally crying because she was the one who was homeless. She was the one who had lost absolutely everything. "Honey, please," my mother sobbed, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. "I know you are so angry. I know we made terrible, horrible mistakes. But we are still your family. We are still your blood. You cannot just leave us out here like this. The bank took the house, Hannah. We have absolutely nowhere to sleep tonight. Our accounts are completely frozen. You have to help us. We are your parents." Her words hung in the icy air. "We are your parents. We are your blood." They were the exact same manipulative phrases they had used my entire life to keep me obedient, to keep me quiet, to keep me paying their bills while they showered all their affection on Brendan. I looked directly into my mother's weeping eyes. My voice was incredibly steady and completely devoid of any warmth. "Do you remember the storm 3 weeks ago, Patricia?" I asked quietly. "Do you remember standing in the bright, warm hallway of your beautiful house while Richard threw my belongings onto the concrete porch in a torn plastic trash bag? Do you remember watching me shiver in the freezing rain while you told me I was a selfish burden who was no longer a part of your family?" My mother flinched violently as if I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but I did not let her. "You stole my entire life savings of $15,000 while I was standing on that porch begging you to listen," I continued, my words slicing through the noise of the storm. "You deliberately drained my bank account because you wanted me to be completely broke, freezing and desperate. You wanted me to crawl back to you on my hands and knees. You did not care if I had a safe place to sleep. You did not care if I was terrified. You only cared about forcing me to submit to your absolute control." I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out a plain white envelope. I held it out toward her. My mother's eyes instantly lit up with a desperate, pathetic flicker of hope. Her shaking hands reached out and snatched the envelope from my grasp. She truly believed I was handing her a certified check. She truly believed that after everything she had done, she could still manipulate the invisible daughter into saving her. She ripped the envelope open. Her frantic fingers pulled out a single index card and a small folded piece of paper. She stared down at the contents. The hopeful look on her face completely died, twisting into an expression of absolute horror. "It is not a check," I told her coldly. "It is the business card for a court-appointed public defender. And the paper is the address for a very cheap roadside motel right off the interstate. It is the exact same motel you forced me to sleep outside of when you left me with absolutely nothing." My father stared at the cheap motel address in my mother's trembling hand. The realization that they were walking away with absolutely nothing finally crashed over him. The last remaining shreds of his arrogant pride completely shattered right there on the wet concrete. He took a step toward me, completely ignoring my security guards, who immediately tensed and stepped closer to my side. "Hannah, you cannot do this," he begged. His voice was a harsh, raspy whisper. It did not sound like the powerful man who had terrorized me for 28 years. It sounded like a frightened, cornered animal. "You do not understand what the district attorney is threatening to do. They are talking about 20 years in federal prison, Hannah. 20 years. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic gesture of prayer. The rain was soaking completely through his suit jacket, but he did not even seem to notice. "I know I was a terrible father," he pleaded, the tears finally spilling over his eyelids and mixing with the rain on his cheeks. "I know I treated you terribly, but I am begging you. I am begging you for my life. Just give us a loan. You have $32 million. You control the entire trust. All we need is a small fraction of that to hire a decent criminal defense attorney. Just give us enough to keep me and your brother out of a federal penitentiary. Please, Hannah, I will sign whatever you want. I will go away forever. Just do not let them lock me in a cage." I stood absolutely still observing the man who had cast such a dark, suffocating shadow over my entire existence. For my whole life, I had desperately craved his approval. I had worked myself to the bone trying to prove that I was a smart, capable daughter who deserved his respect. I had crunched numbers, balanced ledgers, and paid his household bills, just hoping he would look at me with the same pride he constantly showed Brendan. But looking at him now, I felt absolutely no connection to him whatsoever. The biological tie that bound us together had been completely severed the moment he chose his own greed over my safety. I looked at the public defender's business card clutched in my mother's hand. Then I looked back into my father's desperate, weeping eyes. "I am not going to give you a single dollar from the employee pension funds you tried to destroy," I stated, my voice perfectly level and entirely unmovable. "I am not going to finance your legal defense. You and Brendan chose to steal from innocent, hardworking people to fund a fantasy lifestyle. Now you get to face the absolute reality of those choices." My father dropped to his knees right there on the cold, wet sidewalk. He actually fell to the ground, splashing freezing puddle water onto his slacks. He reached out as if to grab the hem of my coat. "Please, Hannah," he sobbed, staring up at me. "We have no one else. We have absolutely nothing. What are we supposed to do?" I looked down at him. I felt a profound, sweeping sense of closure wash over my entire soul. The cycle of abuse and manipulation was officially permanently broken. I looked at my father kneeling in the rain, and I spoke the exact same words he had used to dismiss my struggles my entire life. "You are smart, Richard," I said, my words landing like heavy stones in the cold air. "You are resourceful. You will figure it out." I did not wait for his response. I did not need to hear another promise or another apology. I turned my back on Richard and Patricia Myers, and I walked away. My security detail fell into step right beside me. We walked toward the waiting vehicle, leaving my parents completely behind. I could hear my mother wailing loudly in the background. I could hear my father sobbing on the concrete, but the sounds grew fainter and fainter with every step I took until they were completely swallowed by the noise of the city and the driving rain. I climbed into the warm, quiet interior of the vehicle. The heavy door closed with a solid, reassuring thud, securely shutting out the storm and the people who had tried to destroy me. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window one last time. They were still standing there in the rain, completely alone, completely powerless, and facing the absolute ruin they had built with their own two hands. My grandfather had given me a heavy black metal card to protect me when I had absolutely nothing. But in the end, the greatest gift he gave me was not the $32 million empire. The greatest gift he gave me was the opportunity to discover my own absolute strength. I had saved the employee pensions. I had secured my own future. I was no longer the invisible bookkeeper waiting for a scrap of affection. I was the master of my own life. This entire journey has taught me a lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. You can never allow toxic people to define your absolute worth, even if those people are your own parents. True family is not determined by blood or by obligation. True family is defined by mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional love. If the people who are supposed to protect you choose to exploit you instead, you have the absolute right to walk away. You have the right to set unbreakable boundaries, and you have the right to build a beautiful, successful life completely without them. Justice is not always about revenge. Sometimes the greatest justice is simply walking away in the rain and leaving the people who hurt you to face their own consequences while you step into your absolute power. Thank you so much for following my story all the way to this conclusion. I hope it gives you the courage to stand up for yourself and to recognize your own incredible value. If you found strength in this story, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content. Drop a comment right now to let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every single comment, and I love seeing our community connect from all over the world. Stay strong, protect your boundaries, and I will see you in the next video. 6 months have passed since that freezing night in the country club parking lot where my entire family dynamic completely shattered. The bitter Ohio winter has finally melted away into a warm and incredibly bright spring. I am sitting at the massive mahogany desk in the executive office of the Harrison Trust Holding Company. The heavy wooden door is open, and I can hear the steady, productive hum of my employees working in the outer offices. I am no longer the exhausted, invisible bookkeeper shivering in a damp jacket in a cheap motel parking lot. I am the sole legal owner of this entire enterprise, and for the first time in my 28 years of life, I am completely at peace. The first few months after the federal raid on my parents' house were incredibly chaotic and deeply overwhelming. The sheer scale of my father and brother's embezzlement took a massive toll on the logistics company. We had to work around the clock to stop the financial bleeding. But numbers are my language, and numbers do not lie. I brought in a completely new team of honest, dedicated financial executives. We scrubbed every single ledger. We completely restructured the operating budget, and we severed every single toxic tie my father had created to fund his criminal lifestyle. But the most important thing we did during those difficult months was rebuild the employee pension fund. I will never forget the morning I called an all-staff meeting in the main warehouse. 300 truck drivers, mechanics, and loading dock workers stood on the concrete floor looking incredibly nervous. They had watched my father get dragged out of his office by federal agents, and they were terrified that their jobs and their retirements were completely gone. I stood in front of them, and I told them the absolute truth about what had happened. I explained what my father had done, but then I showed them the new verified bank statements. I told them I had completely restored their pension fund using the liquid assets from my grandfather's trust. I told them their futures were entirely secure and that no one would ever steal from them again. An older mechanic named Arthur, who had worked for my grandfather 30 years ago, actually broke down and cried right there on the warehouse floor. He walked up to me and shook my hand, telling me that my grandfather would be incredibly proud of the woman I had become. That single moment of genuine connection meant more to me than any of the $32 million sitting in the bank. It was the exact moment I realized I had finally found my true purpose in life. To properly honor my grandfather's legacy and the incredible gift he gave me, I established a new foundation last month. It is officially called the William Harrison Second Chance Scholarship. The foundation provides full tuition funding and living stipends for ambitious young students who come from difficult, toxic, or financially abusive family situations. It is specifically designed for the kids who are told they are a burden, the kids who are kicked out of their homes, and the kids who have to sleep in their cars just because they refuse to submit to greedy, manipulative parents. I review the applications myself every single week. Every time I sign an approval letter, I think about my grandfather pressing that heavy black metal card into my palm and telling me to use it when they left me with nothing. He saved my life, and now his money is going to save hundreds of other young people who just need someone to believe in them. As for my biological family, I have not spoken to them in 6 months. The federal investigation moved with absolute ruthless speed. The authorities seized every single asset my parents and Brendan possessed to pay back the damages. Their beautiful suburban house was foreclosed on and sold at a public auction to cover the massive legal fines. My father pleaded guilty to multiple counts of federal wire fraud and embezzlement to avoid a lengthy, highly publicized trial. He is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. My brother Brendan, who completely turned on my father to save his own skin, received a shorter sentence, but he will carry the heavy label of a convicted felon for the rest of his life. Chloe completely disappeared from his life the moment the money ran out. My mother Patricia lost her prestigious social standing, her wealthy friends, and her perfect, flawless illusion. She is currently living in a very small, very cheap apartment on the edge of town, working as a grocery store cashier again. I used to spend my nights wondering if they ever felt any genuine remorse for what they did to me. I used to wonder if my mother cried because she actually missed her daughter, or if she only cried because she missed having access to my money. But as the months went by, that lingering, painful curiosity slowly evaporated. I finally realized that their inability to love me was never a reflection of my personal worth. It was entirely a reflection of their own deep brokenness. They were empty, greedy people who only saw relationships as financial transactions. The profound liberation I feel now comes from fully accepting that painful truth. I stopped trying to force them to love me and I started choosing to completely love and respect myself. I am thriving, I'm respected by my peers, and I wake up every single morning excited to build a life that belongs entirely to me. Now I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. I want to share something that took me 28 painful years and a freezing night sleeping in my car to finally understand. For my entire life, I truly believed that love was something I had to earn by making myself as small and as useful as possible. I thought that if I paid enough of their bills, if I stayed quiet enough, if I worked hard enough to solve all of their complicated problems, they would eventually look at me and realize I was worthy of their affection. I allowed them to treat me like a piece of invisible furniture, because society teaches us that family is everything and that you must always sacrifice for your blood no matter how badly they treat you. But setting boundaries with a toxic family is not a betrayal. It is absolute fundamental survival. You do not owe your bright future, your hard-earned savings, or your precious peace of mind to people who only value you for what they can aggressively extract from you. Love is not supposed to be a cold, calculated transaction. A parent is supposed to protect you and nurture you, not exploit you to fund their own selfish delusions of grandeur. You do not have to set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. If you are the designated scapegoat in your family, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. Your absolute worth is not defined by their intentional blindness. The fact that they cannot see your brilliance, your kindness, and your incredible value is their tragic failure and not yours. They label you as difficult or dramatic or a burden simply because you refuse to let them use you as a stepping stone anymore. They actively project their own deep flaws onto you because you are the only person in the room strong enough to carry the heavy weight of the actual truth. You have the absolute power to walk away from that heavy, crushing burden. You have the power to stop waiting for an apology that is never going to come. You do not need a secret multi-million-dollar trust fund to take your life back. You just need to recognize that you are entirely complete and worthy, all by yourself. You can build your own beautiful empire. You can build your own chosen family with people who genuinely celebrate you, people who deeply respect your boundaries, and people who love you exactly as you are without any conditions attached. Do not let anyone ever make you feel guilty for walking away from financial or emotional abuse. Do not let society guilt-trip you into breaking your own heart just to keep a dysfunctional family comfortable in their lies. You survived their cruelty, and now it is your absolute turn to thrive. You owe it to yourself to step out of the cold, bitter rain and into the bright, warm light of your own beautiful, successful life. You have the strength inside of you to rewrite your entire story starting right now today. I am so incredibly grateful that you stayed with me through this entire difficult journey. Sharing this deeply personal story was not easy, but knowing that it might help someone else find the courage to stand up to their own toxic family makes it entirely worth it. If my story resonated with your own experiences, if you have ever had to stand up for yourself against manipulative, toxic family members, or if you simply believe that true justice always eventually finds its mark, please hit that like button right now. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue to grow this amazing, supportive community together. I want to hear your voice and your experiences. Drop a comment below and tell me your story of overcoming family trauma. And please let me know where are you watching from right now and what time is it there. I personally read every single comment, and I absolutely love seeing how far this message of healing and justice travels around the world. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for your incredible ongoing support. Always protect your peace, never forget your absolute worth, and I will see you in the next video.